The gavel echoed like a gunshot, sealing what Derek Vance thought was another easy, career-boosting conviction. He smirked at the young black defendant, completely blind to the quiet storm brewing in the gallery. Derek had rigged the evidence, expecting a helpless victim. He didn't know he had just framed the Attorney General's son. The air inside courtroom 4B of the Fulton County Superior Court was thick with a suffocating scent of lemon polish and impending doom. To Derek Vance, led Assistant District Attorney, it was the smell of victory. Derek was a man who moved through the justice system not as a blind arbiter of truth, but as an apex predator, tailored in an expensive charcoal suit with silver hair swept perfectly back. Derek looked every bit the distinguished legal mind. Beneath that veneer, however, beat the heart of a bigot who viewed the law as a weapon wielded against those he deemed undesirable. Today's target was 18-year-old Cameron Hale. Cameron sat at the defense table, his frame slight but his posture remarkably straight, inside an oversized off-the-rack grey suit. He was accused of grand larceny in the first degree and aggravated assault against Grant Ellison, the scion of a local real estate dynasty. The incident allegedly occurred at the hyper-exclusive Oak Ridge Country Club, where Cameron had been working a summer job as a caddy. According to the prosecution, Cameron had cornered Grant in the locker room, violently beaten him, and stolen a custom luxury watch valued at over $200,000. It was a complete fabrication. Derek knew it was a fabrication, but Derek didn't care. Grant Ellison had actually lost the watch in a high-stakes illegal poker game off property and sustained his injuries in a drunken brawl with the men who had taken it. Desperate to hide his gambling debts from his tyrannical father, Grant had pointed a shaking, bruised finger at the quiet, newly hired black caddy. Derek, a golfing buddy of Grant's father, had been quietly contacted to make the problem disappear. Derek had obliged. He despised the fact that Oak Ridge had started hiring minorities in an effort to diversify, viewing it as an invasion of his private sanctuary. Pinning the crime on Cameron was, in Derek's twisted mind, killing two birds with one stone, saving a friend's son and removing a thug from his club. "All rise!" the bailiff bellowed, his voice cracking through the stifling tension of the room. The Honorable Judge Eleanor Hargrove presiding. Judge Hargrove took the bench, her black robes snapping around her like a thundercloud. She was a no-nonsense veteran of the bench who possessed an uncanny ability to spot a lie from a mile away. However, she was bound by the evidence presented in her courtroom, and Derek had ensured the evidence against Cameron Hale was a meticulously constructed Iron Maiden. "Be seated," Judge Hargrove commanded, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses. She looked down at the docket. State of Georgia versus Cameron Hale. Are both sides ready to proceed with opening statements? "The state is ready, Your Honor," Derek said, his voice a smooth, resonant baritone that filled the room. He stood, buttoning his suit jacket with a practiced, arrogant flair. "The defense is ready, Your Honor," replied Lauren Mitchell. Lauren was a public defender running on fumes and black coffee. She was sharp, deeply empathetic, and fiercely protective of her clients. But she was notoriously overworked. Derek had banked on her not having the time or resources to dig deeply into the Oak Ridge Country Club's heavily guarded security protocols. Derek stepped out from behind the prosecutor's table and walked slowly toward the jury box. He made eye contact with each juror, projecting an aura of absolute certainty and righteous indignation. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Derek began, his tone hushed, forcing the jurors to lean in. "Oak Ridge is a sanctuary, a place where families go to feel safe, to escape the rising tide of violence that plagues our streets. But on that evening, that safety was violently ripped away. He paused, turning slowly to point a manicured finger directly at Cameron. The defendant, Cameron Hale, was invited into this sanctuary. He was given a job, an opportunity. And how did he repay that generosity? With brutal, savage violence. Derek's choice of words was deliberate. Carefully chosen dog whistles designed to evoke deeply ingrained racist stereotypes. He didn't belong in that locker room. He waited in the shadows, and when Grant Ellison, a young man with a bright future, walked in, the defendant struck. Derek paced back and forth, weaving his narrative of terror. He spoke of the brutal injuries Grant sustained, painting Cameron not as an 18-year-old boy, but as a hulking menace. He mentioned the stolen watch, framing it as the ultimate symbol of Cameron's greed and refusal to earn an honest living. The defense will try to tell you this is a misunderstanding. Derek scoffed, his lips curling into a sneer. They will try to play on your sympathies, but the evidence will show a clear, undeniable truth. You will see security footage. You will hear from eyewitnesses. You will hear from the victim himself. The defendant brought the savagery of the streets into a place of peace. It is your duty to ensure he faces the consequences. Derek returned to his seat, practically glowing with self-satisfaction. He leaned over to his junior assistant and whispered, "Hook, line, and sinker." It was Lauren Mitchell's turn. She stood, smoothing down her skirt, and approached the jury. She didn't have Derek's theatrical polish, but she had a raw, undeniable sincerity. "Mr. Vance tells a compelling story," Lauren began, her voice steady. "But that is exactly what it is. A story, a fiction constructed to protect the real perpetrators and to scapegoat an innocent young man." She walked over and stood right behind Cameron, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Cameron didn't flinch. He sat incredibly still, his dark eyes locked on Derek Vance. There was no fear in those eyes, only a cold, analytical observation that unnerved Derek slightly, though he quickly brushed it off. "Cameron Hale is 18 years old," Lauren continued. "He was working double shifts at Oak Ridge to save money for college. On the night in question, Cameron was cleaning golf carts on the other side of the property. The state's eyewitnesses are nothing more than friends of the alleged victim covering up a mistake. The security footage they will present is impossibly blurry, obscured by a convenient glitch in the system. We will prove that Cameron Hale is not a criminal. He is a victim of a system that decided he was the perfect fall guy." As Lauren concluded her opening statement and returned to her seat, Derek leaned back in his leather chair, suppressing a laugh. She had nothing. No alibi witnesses, no counter footage, just reasonable doubt, which Derek knew he could easily bury under a mountain of fabricated certainty. "The state may call its first witness," Judge Hargrove announced. "The state calls Richard Cunningham, general manager of the Oak Ridge Country Club," Derek declared. Richard Cunningham was a nervous man. He was sweating profusely, despite the heavy air conditioning in the courtroom, dabbing his forehead with a monogrammed silk handkerchief as he took the oath. Cunningham was an accomplice to the lie, strong-armed by Grant's father, who sat on the club's board of directors. If Cunningham didn't corroborate the story, he would lose his highly lucrative position. Derek approached the witness stand with the gentle, guiding demeanor of a shepherd. "Mr. Cunningham," Derek smiled warmly, "thank you for being here. I know reliving this traumatic event is difficult for you and the Oak Ridge community." "Yes, sir, it is," Cunningham stammered, avoiding looking in Cameron's direction. "Can you describe the hiring process for the caddy program?" Derek asked, particularly regarding the defendant. Well, Cunningham swallowed hard. We usually rely on recommendations from members, but recently we implemented a community outreach program to, give back. Cameron Hale was a part of that initiative. A charity hire, Derek said, letting the words hang in the air, dripping with condescension. I see. And did you have any disciplinary issues with the defendant prior to the assault? Lauren Mitchell jumped to her feet. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance. The prosecution is attempting to assassinate my client's character with unrelated matters. I am merely establishing a pattern of behavior, Your Honor. Derek countered smoothly to show that the defendant had a history of insubordination. Overruled, Judge Hargrove said, her expression tight. But tread lightly, Mr. Vance. Were there issues, Mr. Cunningham? Derek pressed. He was caught in areas of the club he wasn't supposed to be in. Cunningham lied. Derek had practically fed him the line during prep. The members' lounge, the private dining rooms, we had complaints that he made people uncomfortable. Uncomfortable? Derek repeated, pacing before the jury. A young man brought in through charity lurking in private areas, and on the night in question, this lurking escalated, didn't it? Yes, Cunningham said, gripping the edges of the witness box. I was in my office near the locker room. I heard a commotion, shouting, the sound of glass breaking. I ran out into the hallway and saw. He hesitated, the weight of the perjury catching in his throat. What did you see, Mr. Cunningham? Derek's voice sharpened, a silent command to deliver the rehearsed lines. I saw the defendant, Cunningham said quickly, his eyes darting to the floor. Cameron Hale. He was sprinting out of the locker room doors, clutching something metallic in his hand. He nearly knocked me over as he ran out the back exit. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Derek turned to the jury, nodding grimly, as if confirming their worst suspicions. And when you entered the locker room? Derek asked softly. I found Grant Ellison on the floor. He was bleeding heavily from his face. He kept saying, "The caddy took it. He took my watch." Thank you, Mr. Cunningham, Derek said, turning his back on the witness. No further questions. Lauren Mitchell stood up for cross-examination. She carried a thick file folder, flipping it open as she approached the stand. Mr. Cunningham, Lauren began, her voice sharp. You claim you saw my client running from the locker room. Yet, according to the employee time clock logs, which I have right here, Lauren pulled out a sheet of paper. Cameron Hale clocked out a full 30 minutes before the alleged assault. Cunningham blanched, looking desperately at Derek. Derek stood up immediately. Objection, Your Honor. Those logs are notoriously unreliable. The defense knows full well employees frequently forget to clock out or clock out early while still on the premises. Sustained, Judge Hargrove ruled. The jury will note the discrepancy, but the log itself does not prove the defendant was not on the property. Lauren didn't miss a beat. Mr. Cunningham, you said Cameron was clutching something metallic. Could you identify it as a watch? It was shiny. It looked like a watch. The hallway outside the locker room is famously poorly lit, designed to create a moody, exclusive ambiance according to your own promotional materials. Is that correct? Yes, but I saw what I saw, Cunningham snapped, growing defensive. Are you aware, Mr. Cunningham, that your own security cameras outside that very hallway suffered a convenient power surge exactly during the time of the alleged incident? Lauren asked, her voice echoing in the silent room. A window that erased the entire event. I am not an IT professional. Cunningham deflected, sweat now dripping down his neck. I managed the staff. Isn't it true? Lauren stepped closer, locking eyes with the manager. That Grant Ellison owed a substantial sum to an underground sports betting ring, and that his father threatened to cut him off entirely if he didn't settle his debts. Objection! Derek roared, slamming his hand on the table. He was genuinely furious now. Inflammatory. highly prejudicial, and based on baseless rumors, counsel is trying to put the victim on trial. Your Honor, it goes directly to motive for fabricating the theft, Lauren argued passionately. Sustained, Judge Hargrove said sharply, banging her gavel. The jury will disregard that last question. Miss Mitchell, you are on very thin ice. Restrict your questions to the facts of this case, not wild conspiracy theories. Lauren sighed, frustration evident in the slump of her shoulders. The judge's ruling had successfully crippled her main defense strategy. Derek had successfully blocked the truth behind a wall of procedural objections. No further questions, Lauren said quietly, retreating to her seat. Derek smiled, a cold, predatory grin. The trap was sprung. The boy was going to prison, and Derek was going to look like a hero to the wealthy elite of Fulton County. He leaned back in his chair, looking over at Cameron Hale. He expected to see a teenager broken, crying, or terrified by the reality of a long prison sentence closing in on him. Instead, Derek saw something that sent a microscopic chill down his spine. Cameron wasn't looking at the judge. He wasn't looking at Lauren Mitchell. He was looking down at a yellow legal pad. With a calm, deliberate precision, the 18-year-old was writing notes, not frantic scribbles, but structured, organized legal shorthand. Suddenly, Cameron tore a piece of paper from the pad and slid it across the table to Lauren. Lauren frowned, picking up the note. As she read it, the color completely drained from her face. She looked at Cameron, her eyes wide with absolute shock. And then she slowly turned to look at the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom. Derek followed her gaze, his brow furrowing in confusion. The heavy mahogany doors of courtroom 4B swung open with a slow, deliberate creak that cut through the silence of the room. The bailiff instinctively moved toward the back, ready to reprimand the latecomers. But he stopped dead in his tracks. 3 men stepped into the courtroom. The 2 on the outside were built like linebackers, wearing dark suits with coiled earpieces trailing down their necks. Executive protection detail. But it was the man in the center who pulled the air from the room. He wore a tailored navy pinstripe suit that projected sheer authority. He was tall, powerfully built, with striking, intelligent eyes and a face familiar to every lawyer, judge, and politician in the state. It was Victor Hale, the state attorney general, the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the state of Georgia, a man known for his ruthlessness against corruption, his brilliant legal mind, and his terrifyingly quiet demeanor when angered. Derek Vance's heart skipped a beat. Why the hell was the Attorney General walking into a low-level grand larceny trial? Was he doing an unannounced audit? Was he observing Derek's technique? Derek instinctively sat up straighter, adjusting his tie, hoping to make a good impression. Victor didn't look at Derek. He didn't look at the judge. He walked straight down the center aisle, his heavy leather shoes echoing against the hardwood floor. He bypassed the gallery seating. He bypassed the bar that separated the spectators from the legal teams. Victor Hale walked directly toward the defense table. Lauren Mitchell scrambled to stand up, knocking her chair back in her haste. "General Hale," she stammered. Victor ignored her. He stopped behind Cameron's chair. He placed a large, commanding hand on the young man's shoulder. Cameron finally looked up from his legal pad. The stoic, unreadable expression he had worn all morning melted away. "Hey, Dad," Cameron said softly. Derek Vance felt the blood freeze in his veins. The courtroom began to spin. "Dad!" The silence in courtroom 4B was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that precedes a catastrophic shift in atmospheric pressure. Derek Vance's manicured hands, previously resting with relaxed confidence on the mahogany prosecution table, were now gripping the edges so tightly his knuckles had turned bone white. Dad, Derek whispered to himself, the syllable tasting like ash in his mouth. Judge Eleanor Hargrove leaned forward, her wire-rimmed glasses slipping slightly down the bridge of her nose. She looked from the stoic 18-year-old at the defense table to the towering figure of the state attorney general. General Hale, Judge Hargrove said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. To what do we owe the honor of your presence in my courtroom? Victor Hale kept his hand on Cameron's shoulder. He looked at his son with a mixture of fierce pride and deep paternal concern before turning his steel-gray eyes to the bench. My apologies for the interruption, Your Honor. Victor's voice was a deep rumble that commanded instant authority. I am here in two capacities. First, as a father. This young man is Cameron Hale, my son. A collective gasp echoed from the gallery. Reporters, who had been half asleep in the back row, suddenly scrambled for their legal pads, their pens flying across the paper. Derek felt a cold bead of sweat slide down his spine, soaking into the silk lining of his expensive suit. His mind raced frantically, trying to piece together how he had missed this. He had looked at Cameron Hale and seen a stereotype, a poor black kid from the south side of Atlanta who had gotten lucky with a charity job. He hadn't bothered to run a deep background check. He hadn't looked into the mother's maiden name. He had just assumed his own prejudice had created a massive, fatal blind spot. Cameron, Victor continued, his voice echoing in the rafters, insisted on dropping my surname when he applied for his summer jobs. He wanted to learn the value of hard work without the shield of my office or the privilege of our family's network. He wanted to be judged entirely on his own merits. Victor's gaze slowly drifted over to Derek. The look was so piercing, it felt physical. Unfortunately, it appears he was judged by a much darker metric. General Hale, Derek stammered, scrambling to his feet. He forced a strained, sickly smile. This is quite a revelation. Had my office known the defendant was your son, we certainly would have handled this investigation with more nuance. Nuance? Victor snapped, the word cracking like a whip. Is that what the Fulton County District Attorney's Office calls basic due process these days, Mr. Vance? Do you reserve nuance only for the children of the political elite while throwing the full fabricated weight of the state at everyone else? Objection, Derek cried out, his polished facade cracking. Your Honor, I resent the implication. The state has presented perjury, Victor interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous, terrifying calm. He stepped away from Cameron and approached the bench. Your Honor, I am officially filing an appearance as co-counsel for the defense alongside Miss Mitchell. Lauren Mitchell, still wide-eyed and clutching the legal pad Cameron had passed her, nodded vigorously. The defense welcomes the General's assistance, Your Honor. Furthermore, Victor continued, reaching into the inner pocket of his tailored suit and withdrawing a sealed manila envelope, I am filing an emergency motion to dismiss all charges against Cameron Hale with prejudice, citing egregious prosecutorial misconduct, subornation of perjury, and severe violations of the Brady Doctrine. The courtroom erupted. Judge Hargrove slammed her gavel down repeatedly. Order! Order in this court! She bellowed. Once the room settled back into a tense hush, she glared at Victor. Those are incredibly severe accusations, General. You are bypassing the entire appellate process and crashing a live trial. You had better have the evidence to back this up. I have the Georgia Bureau of Investigation standing by in the hallway, Your Honor, Victor stated. And the evidence is not just compelling, it is radioactive. Derek's stomach plummeted into an endless freefall. He looked at Richard Cunningham, the club manager, who was still sitting in the witness box. Cunningham was hyperventilating, his face the color of wet chalk. Your Honor, Derek pleaded, desperation bleeding into his tone. This is a theater tactic. The Attorney General is using his political weight to intimidate this court and rescue his son from a legitimate felony charge. Judge Hargrove looked at Derek with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. She had known Derek for years and had always suspected his pristine conviction rate was built on a foundation of ethical shortcuts. "Mr. Vance, you will sit down and remain silent," Judge Hargrove ordered coldly. She turned back to Victor. "Call your witness, General." The defense called Special Agent Gregory Miller of the GBI Cybercrimes Division, Victor announced. The heavy oak doors opened again, and a severe-looking man in a sharply pressed suit walked down the aisle carrying a sleek silver laptop and a projector drive. He took the oath and sat in the witness stand right next to where Cunningham had nearly collapsed moments before. Derek slumped in his chair. He knew exactly what was on that laptop. "Agent Miller," Victor began, pacing slowly in front of the jury box. "Can you explain to the court what the defense asked you to investigate 48 hours ago?" "Yes, sir," Agent Miller replied smoothly. "You requested an independent forensic audit of the security network at the Oak Ridge Country Club, specifically regarding a supposed power surge that erased footage on the night in question. And what did your audit reveal?" "It revealed that there was no power surge," Miller stated matter-of-factly. "The system logs show that the cameras outside the locker room were manually deactivated from the general manager's IP address and rebooted shortly after. A window that erased the entire incident." A murmur rippled through the jury. Lauren Mitchell leaned over and squeezed Cameron's arm. Cameron offered a small, knowing smile. "Manually deactivated," Victor repeated, letting the words marinate. "But Agent Miller, Oak Ridge is a high-end facility. Don't they utilize modern data redundancy protocols?" "They do," Miller nodded. "While the local hard drives were wiped, the Oak Ridge IT infrastructure automatically uploads a mirrored, encrypted backup to a secure cloud server every 60 seconds. The management was completely unaware of this failsafe. Derek felt his chest tighten. He was having trouble drawing breath. The walls of courtroom 4B were closing in on him. "Did you retrieve that backup footage from the cloud servers?" Victor asked. "I did, and I have it queued up for the court." "With the court's permission," Victor gestured to the projector screen that had been rolled out. "Proceed," Judge Hargrove said. Her eyes locked onto the screen. Agent Miller tapped his keyboard. The screen flickered to life, displaying the high-definition infrared-enhanced security feed of the hallway outside the Oak Ridge locker room. The video was silent, but the violence was deafening. Grant Ellison, the supposed victim, did not walk into the locker room alone. He was dragged into the hallway by two large, heavily tattooed men. Grant was thrashing, clearly intoxicated. The men threw him against the oak-paneled wall. One of the men grabbed Grant by the collar, shouting in his face, before delivering 3 brutal, rapid-fire punches to Grant's jaw and eye. The jury gasped in unison. The second man then grabbed Grant's left arm, violently unclasping the gleaming luxury watch from his wrist. He shoved the bleeding heir to the ground, spat on him, and both men casually walked out the back exit. At no point in the video did Cameron Hale appear. Cameron, as the time logs had proven, was already halfway home. "Pause the video," Victor commanded. He turned to the jury, his face carved from granite. "The men in this video have been identified by the GBIER as enforcers for an illegal sports betting syndicate. Grant Ellison owed them a substantial sum." General Victor Hale's voice boomed. Derek Vance knew this. He knew it because Grant's father, Charles Ellison, panicked. Charles Ellison didn't want the humiliation of his son's gambling addiction going public. He didn't want the police looking into his family's finances. So he called his old friend, led Assistant District Attorney Derek Vance. "This is slander!" Derek shouted, jumping up, his face purple with rage and terror. "You have no proof of these defamatory lies." "Agent Miller," Victor said, ignoring Derek entirely. "Did you also execute a financial warrant on Mr. Vance's accounts?" "We did," Miller confirmed. "Specifically, a Shell LLC registered under Mr. Vance's wife's maiden name. We traced a wire transfer into that account. The origin of the transfer was a holding company wholly owned by Charles Ellison." The courtroom descended into absolute chaos. Derek collapsed back into his chair, the fight completely draining out of him. The swagger, the arrogance, it all evaporated, leaving behind a pathetic, terrified man who had just been caught in the ultimate snare. He had tried to frame a black teenager because he thought the boy was invisible. He thought the boy had no power, no voice, and no one who would fight for him. Judge Eleanor Hargrove's gavel struck the sound block with the force of a hammer driving a nail into a coffin. "Bailiff!" Judge Hargrove roared, her voice trembling with righteous fury. "You will take Derek Vance into custody immediately. He is to be remanded to the holding cells without bail pending formal charges of bribery, conspiracy, and subornation of perjury." Two armed bailiffs advanced on the prosecution table. Derek didn't resist. He slowly stood up, raising his wrists as the cold steel handcuffs clicked shut over his tailored cuffs. The metallic sound echoed through the silent room, a stark contrast to the fictional clinking of the watch Derek had lied about. "Mr. Vance," Judge Hargrove said, leaning over the bench, her eyes filled with contempt. "You have disgraced this profession. You have weaponized this courtroom. You thought you could throw a young man's life away as a favor to your wealthy friends." She looked over at Cameron. Her expression softened into deep regret. "Cameron, on behalf of the state of Georgia, I am profoundly sorry for what you have endured. The charges against you are dismissed with prejudice. You are entirely free to go." Cameron stood up. He buttoned his oversized, off-the-rack suit jacket. He looked at Derek, who was being marched out of the courtroom in disgrace. Cameron didn't gloat. He didn't cheer. He simply nodded, a quiet acknowledgement that justice, though delayed and nearly derailed, had finally arrived. Victor Hale pulled his son into a tight embrace right there in the middle of the courtroom. Lauren Mitchell wiped a tear from her eye, grinning from ear to ear. The predator had finally become the prey. Derek Vance traded his expensive charcoal suit for the abrasive, heavily starched neon orange polyester of the Fulton County Jail. The transition was neither swift nor dignified. It was a public, agonizing dismantling of a man who had built an empire on the broken backs of those he deemed beneath him. The media frenzy was absolute. Headlines across the country dubbed it the Country Club Conspiracy. General Victor Hale did not just remove Derek from his post, he ordered a forensic excavation of Derek's entire career. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation descended upon the district attorney's office, seizing servers, physical files, and financial records. What they found was a staggering labyrinth of corruption. Derek had not just framed Cameron. He had routinely suppressed evidence, intimidated witnesses, and colluded with wealthy defense attorneys to orchestrate favorable outcomes for Atlanta's elite. The collateral damage of Derek's arrogance was spectacular. Charles Ellison, Grant's father, was indicted on federal charges of bribery, wire fraud, and money laundering in connection with the underground betting syndicate. His vast real estate empire crumbled overnight. His assets were frozen by the very state authorities he thought he could buy. Grant Ellison, facing a mountain of debt and the terrifying reality of life without his trust fund, accepted a plea deal, turning state's evidence against the violent enforcers who had beaten him in exchange for a lighter sentence. But the hardest hit of karma was reserved for Derek himself. When Derek's own trial began a year later, the courtroom dynamics had radically shifted. Because the state had seized his bank accounts under the RICO Act, Derek could not afford the high-priced defense attorneys he used to play golf with. Those men, terrified of being caught in Hale's crosshairs, wouldn't return Derek's frantic phone calls from the holding block. Instead, Derek was assigned a public defender, a young, overworked attorney who looked remarkably like Lauren Mitchell had on Cameron's first day in court. Derek sat at the defense table, his silver hair unkempt, his face drawn and sallow. He watched in silent, helpless horror as a jury of his peers, working-class citizens of Fulton County, the very demographics he had spent decades systematically marginalizing, found him guilty on dozens of counts of corruption, bribery, and subornation of perjury. Judge Eleanor Hargrove, refusing to recuse herself from the sentencing phase, stared down at him with eyes devoid of an ounce of pity. She sentenced him to 25 years in the Georgia State Penitentiary without the possibility of parole for 15. As the gavel fell, Derek looked back at the gallery. He hoped to see a friend, a colleague, or even his wife who had filed for divorce the day his assets were frozen. Instead, the gallery was filled with the families of the innocent people he had wrongfully convicted over the years. Their faces formed a sea of vindicated relief. Meanwhile, Cameron Hale did not allow the trauma of his near miss with destruction to turn into bitterness. He used it as jet fuel. After completing his undergraduate degree with highest honors, Cameron was accepted into a prestigious law school. He didn't hide from his past. He wrote his admissions essay entirely on the concept of blind spots in the judicial system, citing his own terrifying experience as a catalyst for change. He spent his summers not at lucrative corporate firms, but working in the trenches with the Innocence Project, alongside a recently promoted supervising attorney named Lauren Mitchell. Together, they used the GBI's audit of Derek Vance's old cases to systematically exonerate a dozen wrongfully convicted men and women. A decade passed. The world moved on, but the concrete walls of the state penitentiary remained agonizingly still for Derek Vance. At 62 years old, Derek was a ghost of a man. He walked with a limp from a yard incident he refused to talk about, and his once booming voice had withered into a raspy whisper. After serving his mandatory minimum, Derek was finally eligible for a parole hearing. He desperately prepared a statement of profound manufactured remorse, hoping to manipulate the board just as he had manipulated juries in his prime. He was escorted into the sterile, fluorescent-lit hearing room by 2 guards. He sat down in a bolted metal chair across from the 3-person parole board. "Mr. Vance," the chairman of the board began, looking over a thick file. "Before we review your institutional record, the state has sent a special representative from the Attorney General's Civil Rights Division to offer a statement on the impact of your release." The side door of the hearing room opened. Derek's breath caught in his throat. In walked a tall, sharply dressed man in his late 20s. He wore a tailored navy pinstripe suit that projected sheer, undeniable authority. His posture was impeccable. His gaze was analytical and piercing. It was Cameron. Cameron sat down next to the board members. He didn't look angry. He didn't look vengeful. He looked at Derek with the cold, absolute objectivity of the law, the very thing Derek had perverted for so long. "Mr. Vance," Cameron said, his deep voice filling the small, suffocating room. "Years ago, you stood in a courtroom and told a jury that I was a savage who did not belong. You told them I was a danger to society based on nothing but your own bigotry and greed." Derek swallowed hard, his trembling hands clasped in his lap. "Cameron, Mr. Hale, please. I am a changed man. I have lost everything." "You lost the privileges you stole," Cameron corrected softly, his tone unyielding. "You used your power to destroy lives, and for that you have served time. But the state's position is that a man who utilizes the justice system as a weapon of prejudice can never fully be trusted to reintegrate without strict, unrelenting oversight. You are not the victim here, Derek. You are the consequence." Cameron opened his briefcase and slid a document across the table to the board. It was a comprehensive psychological profile paired with a list of the exact lives Derek had ruined. Lives Cameron himself had spent the last decade piecing back together. Derek stared at the young attorney, the realization crashing down upon him with crushing, unbearable weight. The scared kid he had tried to bury had grown into the system's greatest guardian. The trap Derek had set all those years ago hadn't caught a victim. It had forged his own judge. As the parole board unanimously stamped "denied" on his file, Derek Vance closed his eyes, the heavy click of the guard's handcuffs echoing the finality of his fate. In the end, the gavel that Derek Vance used to shatter innocent lives became the instrument of his own destruction. Justice, though briefly blinded by arrogance and prejudice, ultimately found its way through the dark. Cameron transformed a weaponized system into a shield for the vulnerable, proving that true power lies not in the authority to condemn, but in the unyielding, courageous pursuit of the truth.